So good afternoon. Welcome to the International Peace Institute. I am Maureen Quinn, Director of Programs. Today, it is a great pleasure to launch the International Peace Institute's latest book, Responding to Genocide, The Politics of International Action. The book, co-edited by our own Adam Lupel and Ernesto Verdeja, represents the results of an intense extended research partnership that connected the policy and the academic arenas on the issue of genocide and the politics of international action. The politics of the title is the key word in understanding what the book offers. The editors and authors in the volume do a great job probing the issues of political will, political interests, and political positions in the international community. And so thank you for joining us for this important discussion. We'll hear first from the book's two editors. Adam Lupel, the editor and senior fellow at the International Peace Institute, will speak first. Adam will explain the rationale of the book, what motivated this project, and outline some of the key findings from the book on the international response to genocide. Ernesto Verdeja, the Assistant Professor of Political Science and Peace Studies at the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies at the University of Notre Dame, will then speak about the definitions of genocide and talk about the root causes of genocide. We're also very pleased to have Gillian Kitley, Senior Officer in the United Nations Office on Genocide Prevention and the Responsibility to Protect. She's our discussant on the panel. We look to Jill to give us a perspective on the United Nations work on addressing the issue of genocide. So for the policy community here at headquarters of the United Nations, the representatives with us today from the missions, those of you from the United Nations system, and civil society, the book raises some very challenging and interesting questions. And among them, I would mention, is it fair to say that the international community's consideration of action in response to genocide often gets bogged down in debates over the definition of genocide? Do debates over the definitions obscure the need to stop the killing and focus on the root causes of genocide? Is academic research tied to a broad definition of genocide relevant to the discussions at the UN headquarters on responding to genocide? What can the UN headquarters community learn from this research? Does civil society action, the grassroots movements as considered in the book, strengthen international action to stop genocide? And what about regional organizations? What role do they have in the international response to genocide? So this is an opportunity to discuss some of these questions. Each speaker has been asked to limit to their comments, I think, to no more than 15, max 20 minutes. And so we look forward to hearing from each of you. So Adam, I'd like to introduce you briefly and then turn the mic over to you. Adam, as I said, he's the editor and senior fellow here at IPI. He's the one who directs the review, the production, the dissemination of all of our books, policy reports, and related publications. A very key individual here at IPI, who certainly I know I rely on extensively. Adam is the author of Globalization and Popular Sovereignty, Democracy's Transnational Dilemma, and he's the co-editor of Peace Operations and Organized Crime, Enemies or Allies. Prior to coming here at IPI, Adam was the managing editor of Constellations, an international journal of critical and democratic theory, and he taught modern and contemporary political theory at the New School's Eugene Lang College in New York. So Adam, the mic is yours.
Thank you, Maureen, for that very nice introduction. I'd also like to thank my co-editor, Ernesto, my co-editor and friend, for working with me on this project for quite some time, and also thank you, Jill, for agreeing to speak today with us. I also would like to thank the governments of Norway and Finland, acknowledge their support for IPI's conflict prevention work, of which this is a part. And really, I'd like to just give a general thank you to all my colleagues at IPI for supporting me in this endeavor for quite some time. This project on responding to genocide is motivated by three principal questions. What strategies and policies are available to prevent or stop genocide and mass atrocities? Who is best positioned to act, and when? And what are the principal obstacles to timely and effective responses? The book addresses these questions by examining the distinct actors and tools used in efforts to prevent and stop genocide, from the local, national, international, and transnational levels, with a particular focus on international responses. In a variety of chapters, we examine such tools as early warning mechanisms, preventive diplomacy and mediation, civil society pressure, Security Council sanctions, and military intervention, among others. And through the course of the study, we found that how the international system responds depends upon how these elements interact, and how the politics of national self-interest and international diplomacy play out at each stage. What I'd like to do is highlight three basic, very broad takeaways, and I'll focus a little bit on the third, and then in the subsequent presentations, I think we're going to nail down into some more details. So just to kind of frame the discussion, I'm going to give a little bit of a broad framework here. One, when we speak about response, response includes intervention and prevention. We see response in a broad sense as including both prevention and intervention, and not simply in a sequential order. They're often intertwined. That is, intervention is not simply a result of failed prevention. International responses can take many forms at various stages. In that sense, our approach is, I think, comes naturally out of the three-pillar approach to R2P. And as a response in the sense that in the past, intervention discourse focused in large part on the practical, legal, and political questions surrounding external actors' authority to intervene militarily in a target state. While debates about military intervention are very important, and it is very much a part of the book as well, Tom Weiss's chapter discusses this at length in the volume. A narrow focus on external coercive force draws attention away from the host of other tools that international and regional and national actors have at their disposal. So that when we speak about response, it should be understood that military intervention is one tool among many, and that international actors can and should respond to the risks of genocide and mass atrocities long before violence ever takes place. And one way to do this is to support national and regional prevention processes, as described in the most recent Secretary General's report on R2P, of which I suspect our discussant might have had something to do with. Two, effective response then requires cooperation. Actors from a variety of social and institutional levels must come together using a variety of tools. This includes cooperation among international actors and between international actors and national and regional actors. Responses to mass atrocity have added legitimacy when international actors cooperate with national and regional partners, and preventive diplomacy works best when third-party mediators work together and speak with one voice. And this leads to the third basic point. With so many actors needing to cooperate, the problem, time and time again, is that international responses come against the problems of political will and division as principal obstacles to timely and effective action. In the book, various authors make reference to this in relation to the cases of Rwanda, Bosnia, Darfur, and most recently, Syria. Yesterday, when we were discussing the panel, Maureen commented to me that in reading the volume, it was a bit depressing. And I said, well, books about genocide tend to be that way. And I think, though, from an international perspective, I think part of what makes it a little bit depressing is the failures of international actors are so tragic and pervasive. But we have to hope that we can do better. But I think it is important to recognize that there has been tremendous normative progress in recent years regarding international commitments to prevent mass atrocity crimes through the development of R2P and the protection of civilians agenda at the UN Security Council, among other places. And Colin Keating's chapter describes this in detail. But normative progress has not translated into practical commitments to act when necessary, including militarily. The contrast between action on Libya and, for so long, inaction on Syria has been the most obvious case in point. Debates about how best to respond to genocide and mass atrocity often come down to a kind of frustration that even when we know what needs to be done, which we don't always, these issues are very complex and defy easy answers. Even if we know what needs to be done, so often we lack the political will to act in a timely way because of concerns about sovereignty, because of domestic political opposition, because of financial concerns, or other reasons. So the question for the international system becomes, how can the political will to respond be developed over the long term? Admittedly, the very concept of political will, I think, is vague. We understand political will in the sense of simply the capacity to come together to act in concert. In this case, the ability to commit to collective action to prevent or stop mass atrocities and genocide. But this proves difficult. There are so many levels and actors in play, often working across purposes or pursuing their own narrow interests. Ultimately, generating political will is itself a political and practical challenge. The possibility of fomenting and sustaining such will needs to be addressed in practice with sensitivities to the particularities of each case. Each situation is distinct, as we know. But analytically, we must be able to think about how to prepare the ground over the long term to transform the political calculus over time. So I'd like to take my final few minutes then to focus on 4 elements that may form part of a long-term strategy to develop a more consistent political will to effectively respond to genocide and mass atrocities. 1, universal norms. 2, common interests. 3, particular incentives. And 4, visionary leadership. First, it is important to work toward the further development, diffusion, and internalization of norms against the use of mass violence on civilians and for the development of practical policies on how to apply those norms. In the wake of the NATO intervention in Libya, it became clear that broad international agreement on the substance of R2P is dampened by significant disagreement on the norm's application, particularly when it comes to the use of military force. The further development and diffusion of specific normative rules and practical policies regarding the protection of civilians and the prevention of atrocity crimes would help to establish objective criteria for engagement by international actors and serve as a reference point for regional organizations and domestic governments to institutionalize their own policies. And actually, we were talking about this before the event. A good amount of this work is currently being done in the United States with the Atrocity Prevention Board. This could serve as a model in some way. Second, there is a need to cultivate recognition that it is in the common interest of all states to stem atrocity crimes. In the terms of the Canadian Will to Intervene project, preventing atrocities should be seen domestically as a vital national interest common to all. Historically, states have not always seen matters this way. Governments, including the US and other Western powers, have made other calculations. Gary Bass's new book, The Blood Telegram, that I think we're going to be presenting here in January, Beyond the Headlines, tells the story of how the US found it in its interest to look the other way as the Pakistani military killed 300,000 Bengalis during the Cold War in the war that led to the independence of Bangladesh. But the task is to change that type of interest calculation, both domestically and internationally. Mass violence against civilians causes refugee flows that can cross international borders, fuel regional instability, and damage transnational economies. This is very evident today on the Syrian borders with Jordan, Lebanon, Iraq, and Turkey. Furthermore, mass atrocities in any one place can undermine the whole system of collective security by calling into question the ability of the Security Council to live up to its responsibility as the authority tasked by law with the maintenance of international peace and security. Curious to witness the recent extraordinary step, I think, by Saudi Arabia to decline a Security Council seat in response to the recent failures. It must be recognized, though, that national interest rather than moral imperative remains the dominant basis of state action in international affairs. If more states understand the prevention of genocide as something that is in their own interest, the greater are the chances that they will cooperate to find effective responses. Third, strategies of response have to incorporate an analysis of the particular incentives at play in any situation. This includes both the parties engaged in violence and the international actors best situated to influence the situation on the ground. The effort to move against Gaddafi was helped by the fact that he had no strong allies with an interest to come to his defense. On the other hand, Assad has been able to count on the support of Russia due to its important economic and military interests in Syria. In any situation, it must be asked, what incentives are there for international actors to engage or disengage? How can these be addressed? Can material or political incentives for local actors be provided by the international community or regional powers? We're talking about issues of aid promises and, very importantly, security guarantees, things of that nature. The key is that any international involvement in a conflict environment must be sensitive to the local political context. Developing strategies that incorporate an analysis of local incentive structures can help to clarify what needs to be done and by whom. Finally, very briefly, the necessity of strong leadership to maintain international commitments to prevent mass atrocities must be acknowledged. Leadership at the highest level can clarify what's at stake, set priorities, and provide political cover for others to act when there are risks involved. The Albright-Cohen report on preventing genocide calls leadership the indispensable ingredient in its plan for U.S. policymakers. This leadership can come from well-placed individuals, powerful nation states, or even energetic civil society groups. The Will to Intervene Project reserves a special role for democratic societies in this regard. In the end, international responses, especially military intervention by international forces, will always be controversial. It will always entail a complicated political calculus with some unknown consequences. And for the foreseeable future, it will remain difficult to avoid an element of selectivity. Sometimes there will be intervention, sometimes not, depending upon the local context and the international interests at play. Thus, to conclude, I'd say the ultimate success in preventing genocide or stopping genocide and mass atrocities will depend upon long-term strategies to prevent them from happening in the first place. But when they do, we know it is critical that international actors come together in their commitment to respond. Thank you.
Great. So thank you, Adam, and for providing that overview of what we can find in the book. I'd now like to introduce Ernesto Verdeja, the other co-editor. As I mentioned, he is a professor of political science and peace studies at the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies at Notre Dame. He's the author of the book entitled Unchopping a Tree, Reconciliation in the Aftermath of Political Violence. And I had to read that title a couple of times, Unchopping a Tree. And he's also co-editor of Genocide Matters, Ongoing Issues and Emerging Perspectives, as well as Globalization, Social Movements, and Peace Building. Ernesto is a board member of the International Association of Genocide Scholars and serves on the advisory board of the Institute for the Study of Genocide. And I said earlier, he's going to talk about the definitions of genocide, some of the issues around root causes as well. So Ernesto, over to you.
Great, thank you very much. Actually, the title comes from a poem, Unchopping a Tree, so I liked it in particular because it's so disconcerting and you have to read it a couple of times. And that's how I feel about political reconciliation. So, in any case, I wanted to start off first of all by thanking Adam Lupel and the International Peace Institute for putting this project together and for organizing this event, as well as Ambassador Maureen Quinn. Thank you very much for participating in this, and Jillian Kitley. It's a real honor to have this group of people here speaking about the project. I was going to focus, as Ambassador Quinn mentioned just a moment ago, more on some of the conceptual and definitional issues around genocide, and then move on to what we know about the causes of genocide and other similar types of armed conflict and significant large-scale human rights violations, so that we can get a sense of what the status of research and our knowledge is and where some of the gaps are. And I think this is important not only for the purpose of research, of course, but also for the purposes of policy making and prevention in the future. And then finally, I'm going to speak a little bit about early warning systems and risk assessment models and where we are with some of those types of projects. And these are all topics that are covered extensively in the book. Several chapters are devoted to each one of these topics. So in essence, I'll be summarizing some of the arguments made in the book, following along the lines of what Adam had just done. I start off by focusing particularly on the question of genocide, because of course genocide is one of the mass atrocity crimes as understood in the responsibility to protect norm or principle, and that includes genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and ethnic cleansing. But genocide tends to be one of the most problematic ones definitionally, and it's problematic not only from a legal perspective, but also from a policy perspective and also from a research perspective. And I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about genocide and what some of the challenges are to understanding what genocide is when we see it, and also some of the problems that arise in the legal context that inform or raise difficulties for policymaking. Now, the history of the term genocide dates back to Raphael Lemkin, a Polish Jewish jurist who developed the term in 1944 to refer to synchronized attacks that are broad-based. And he was particularly interested in thinking about systematic, synchronized, broad-based attacks against certain populations, in particular what he referred to as nations. He didn't really talk specifically about political, racial, or religious groups, and he also thought of genocide mostly as something that included a variety of different violent strategies, anywhere from actual physical destruction all the way through what he referred to as moral debasement, so kind of a cultural destruction of a group. And there were some difficulties with this early definition. In some ways, it was actually sociologically quite informed because it really thought about genocide as an ensemble of different types of techniques and strategies of mass violence. But at the same time, it was unclear how some of these different strategies came together, how they were connected theoretically or practically. In any case, of course, Lemkin was influential in the development of the UN Convention for the Prevention and Punishment of Genocide in 1948 that went into effect in 1951. Which gives us really the dominant definition of genocide today, understood as the intentional destruction of a group in whole or in part, and that group can include a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group. Now, this audience, of course, is familiar with some of the difficulties with the legal definition, so I won't go into this in too much detail. The summary version of this, essentially, is that the definition that we have legally for genocide includes a whole host of very specific types of acts. So these acts have to occur for it to qualify as genocide. And these acts include anything from physical destruction of a group to the commission of serious bodily and mental harm, to creating conditions of life calculated to destroy the group, the imposition of policies to prevent birth, and also the forcible transfer of children. So what we have currently in the legal definition is a host of different strategies or acts that range from overt physical destruction to something like cultural destruction, cultural genocide, even though that term isn't really one that has legal standing. So it's a little unclear sometimes to understand how these different acts connect to one another and what we should be looking for empirically and how many acts really are necessary and over a sustained period of time for it to be considered genocide rather than some other form of mass atrocity. In addition to this, of course, the legal definition stipulates that there are only 4 key victim categories. So if a group of people are targeted based on their group identity, but a group identity that's not national, racial, religious, or ethnic, it's not genocide. So if a group is targeted because of its political or class identity, for instance, it doesn't qualify as genocide, though it may qualify as crimes against humanity or war crimes. In any case, and I don't want to spend too much time on this right now, but what this has led to is a debate among legal scholars and people in the International Criminal Court and other major tribunals to figure out effectively what constitutes a stable group over time, particularly because certain categories, such as ethnic and racial categories, really ethnic category, tend to be unstable. So a number of different norms or principles have emerged within court cases to figure out what constitutes an ethnic group. But these debates have been very, very heated. One of the most interesting cases, of course, is the case of Rwanda, where the ICTR, the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, struggled extensively to figure out whether the Tutsi qualified as an ethnic or a racial or a national group. And it was unclear because from a sociological perspective, they didn't really kind of fit any one of these categories very neatly. So in the end, there was a commitment to think about groups in terms of their stability, whether groups are stable and permanent over time, and this could qualify as an ethnic group for the purposes of prosecution. Now, what this has meant is that these legal debates have informed very much policy debates. And so we've seen these kinds of questions, for instance, in discussions over Darfur in particular. Do the different groups like the Zaghawa, the Four, the Masalit constitute ethnic groups as such? Are they sufficiently stable and permanent to qualify as being victims of genocide? And this is essentially to say that where we are right now is we have a definition of genocide that is used by policymakers and advocacy groups that often recognizes the importance of the UN legal definition, but uses the term in a very different way. And then legal scholars, of course, are bound by the law. So in the book, we explore some of these questions systematically and try to think about the ways in which the term genocide is used by different communities and has different purposes. So advocacy or policy groups, legal groups, and of course, kind of normative and even scholarly groups as well. Another key issue around the question of genocide is intentionality. The crime of genocide is understood as the intentional destruction of a group, in whole or in part. But how do we understand intentionality? This, of course, has also led to a number of very difficult and provocative debates. From a legal perspective, once again, it's important to have a threshold of intentionality that is relatively high. After all, to prosecute someone for genocide, there should be a lot of evidence that is mobilized to show that they are indeed responsible for this terrible crime. From a policy perspective, however, it's difficult to satisfy those intentionality requirements. And if we adopt the standard of intentionality that tends to be used by courts, what we end up with is a standard that is very, very difficult to meet. So the standard court definition of intentionality among legal specialists is basically that intentionality requires the knowledge of the consequences of actions as being genocidal, and furthermore, that the perpetrator, the alleged perpetrator, have the specific intent to carry out genocide. But in fact, what we know is empirically, many times, genocide is carried out, and it may not necessarily be the primary intention of the perpetrators to commit genocidal violence. They may be pursuing something else, but they also pursue genocide as an instrumental tool to accomplish these other goals. So it's very, very difficult to assess or ascertain the status of intentionality from the perspective of policymaking and prevention. So one of the things that's argued in the book, that I argue in particular, is that we have too high a threshold by using this idea of specific intent for the purposes of policy and also for the purposes of research, and that it misrepresents the nature of genocidal violence. I won't say too much more about this. One of the things that we do in the book is try to figure out a set of different proxies that could be used to think about intentionality for the purpose of policymaking and also just basically for the purpose of detection that doesn't rely on this very high, strict threshold of intentionality. But I'd be more than happy to talk about that in the Q&A if you wish. It's always nice to punt to the Q&A. Furthermore, genocide, of course, is one of the main mass atrocity crimes. It's distinguished from crimes against humanity and war crimes in several ways. These things are not absolutely distinguished from one another in practice, but war crimes relates to violations committed only in the context of armed conflict or occupation. Crimes against humanity refer to systematic or widespread gross human rights violations. We can think of genocide as a subset of crimes against humanity. It is easier to prove crimes against humanity because it doesn't require this intentional component nor is it necessarily group-directed. And in practice, we see these different types of atrocities being committed with one another. It's also important, and this is something we emphasize in the book, to avoid this tendency in contemporary debates to focus on these very large-scale violent phenomena in exclusive ways. So we ask ourselves, is something genocide, or is it a really degenerate form of counterinsurgency, as if these things are exclusive of one another? And part of the importance here is really to be more sensitive about the ways in which genocide occurs in the context of other types of large-scale violent phenomena. So counterinsurgency warfare can be genocidal, or it may not be genocidal. It depends. Once it reaches a level where it's actually group-directed, directed against civilian targets, and based on the destruction of that group identity, then it becomes genocidal. But it need not be genocidal, and it certainly is not exclusive of genocide. This holds for war. This also holds for ethnic cleansing. Now, I want to say a few things. Given the kind of the complexity about the definitional and conceptual issues, I do want to say a few things about the causes of genocide and mass atrocity crimes. And specifically, I want to focus on some of the arguments that's made in the book about distinguishing or understanding the main causes of genocide in relationship to the other large-scale violent phenomena of the current world, which is civil war. If we think of genocide as intentional group destructive violence, we can think of civil war as the kind of armed conflict that includes at least two competing actors in one country, and the violence tends to be multi-directional. It's important to keep in mind, of course, that genocide and civil war are not exclusive of one another. The Rwandan case is a perfect example of this. This was a civil war that also included genocide. It was one of the other types of violent events that occurred. Now, we've seen a number of interesting trends over the past, basically since the early 1950s, over the past several decades. We've seen, for instance, that there's been a rise in armed conflict from the 1950s to the 1980s, both in the number and the lethality of armed conflicts. And after the 1980s, it began to decline. This period of decline, or this kind of dynamic of decline, stabilized over the past 5 years or so. And of the armed conflicts that exist in the world today, the majority tend to be civil wars. There are very few interstate wars. And of those majority civil war cases, very, very few cases include genocide. But we can, in fact, identify some similarities between genocide and civil war in terms of their causes or their factors. And this is detailed quite a bit in the book. We find, for instance, that both genocide and civil war include, as one of their primary conditions or factors, past histories of conflict. We also see that the presence of many small groups, such as ethnic groups, is not necessarily an important factor for the onset of genocide or civil war. We've seen that the presence or a tendency to have historical marginalization of groups is important. It's an important prior factor for genocide and civil war, so this is a common factor for both. And also that sharp crises, particularly political instability, is particularly important, especially important for predicting genocide. A little less so for civil war. And here I'm looking at the statistical information, the statistical research that's been produced on genocide and civil war, particularly a chapter by Francis Stewart in the book. Nevertheless, there are differences. We know that genocides, as I mentioned earlier, are significantly less common than civil wars. And if we look at the cluster of economic factors, we find, for instance, that income level differs in for the two violent phenomena. So civil wars are likely in very poor countries, but genocide tends to be more likely in so-called mid-level or mid-income level countries. So that's a distinguishing kind of economic factor between the two. Regime type or political factors are important as well. Civil wars are likely in mixed authoritarian regimes where there's an opportunity structure for certain groups to mobilize themselves and demand political rights of some sort, and then when they're repressed, they may react by taking up arms, and eventually that leads to a civil war. So mixed authoritarian regimes, that is, authoritarian regimes that have some electoral competitiveness, but it's not really that competitive, are more likely to have civil war, whereas genocide tends to be more likely in fully authoritarian cases, like in Rwanda. And finally, for demographic factors, we see that civil wars are more common in cases where you have relatively few ethnic groups or primary political groups that are roughly of the same size, whereas genocide is more common in cases where there is one majority group and a minority targeted group. So these are important also for thinking about the onset and the likelihood of genocide versus civil war. And a final finding in the research is that civil wars make genocide much more likely, but of course not vice versa. I believe I have a few minutes left.
Few.
Just a few? Okay. I'll take few to be very, very few. In the book, we also explore the status of early warning modeling and risk assessment modeling for genocide and other forms of mass atrocity crimes. And I won't say much about it right now, except to say that whereas risk assessment models concern the creation of generally static models that predict the likelihood of significant violence over time, early warning models focus on the identification of triggers and accelerators, so much more immediate factors and causes. Our risk assessment models right now, the quality of the research is quite high, both the statistical quantitative research and also the qualitative research. So we have a pretty good sense of what the main risk indicators and main risk factors are for genocide and other mass atrocity crimes. For early warning modeling, the kind of stuff that focuses on the very short term, this is much more difficult. There are a number of different databases and different groups that are producing really good quality work here. This includes, of course, the UN Special Advisor Office on Genocide Prevention, Responsibility to Protect, which Jillian is associated with, as well as some other projects such as the Sentinel Project and some other advocacy groups. But in general, we haven't been as successful in modeling early warning systems. And we need better work on modeling, particularly the onset of mass atrocity crimes, processes of escalation, sustainment, and abeyance. And specifically thinking about practical ways to identify these different processes and mechanisms. Now, I can say a little bit more, if you're interested in the Q&A, I can say a little bit more about how we've been thinking about modeling these different dynamics, what types of factors we look for, both for risk assessments, but also for early warning systems. But I believe Jillian, our co-panelists, will also have some things to say about this. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Ernesto. I particularly appreciated how you said that the definition of genocide becomes associated with the purpose it's used, and then that distinction on genocide and civil war and the various origins, very informative. So I would now like to introduce Gillian Kitley. She is a senior officer in the United Nations Office on Genocide Prevention and the Responsibility to Protect. She joined the office in 2009 after 15 years working as a United Nations Human Rights Officer in Haiti, Eritrea and Ethiopia, Burundi, Nepal, and Gaza. So we're really glad you are here with such extensive field experience. Her work has included supervision of human rights monitoring, reporting and protection activities of peacekeeping operations, as well as investigations into the serious and massive violations of international human rights and humanitarian law. So as we noted previously, you're going to talk about the UN work on the prevention of genocide. So thank you, Gillian.
Thank you very much for that introduction. And thank you to Adam and to Ernesto for inviting me to take part in this discussion today. I'd like to congratulate you first on this new publication, which highlights some of the main questions that we grapple with in trying to do more and to do better to prevent genocide and other mass atrocities, and to improve the international response to these crimes. I'm going to speak primarily about my own experiences and my work with the Office on Genocide Prevention and the Responsibility to Protect. And also as a practitioner who has some experience on the ground of confronting these issues face to face. For those of you who are not familiar with my office, we're a small office with the status of a special political mission, and we support the work of the two special advisors on the prevention of genocide and on the responsibility to protect. That's Adama Dieng and Jennifer Welsh. The reason that these two advisors work together through a joint office is that, which is quite an unusual setup within the organization. Sorry. Is that there's a lot of complementarity in their mandates, even while they have distinct political tasks. So we have merged those elements which are complementary, including the elements of early warning and assessment, risk assessment of the crimes of genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. The mandate of the Special Advisor on the Prevention of Genocide comes from the Security Council, and the position was established in 2004 directly as a result of the soul-searching that took place within the United Nations, particularly in the 90s and the early 2000s, as a result of the UN's failure to prevent or to halt the genocides in Rwanda and Srebrenica. The mandate of the Special Advisor on the Responsibility to Protect comes from the General Assembly, and the position was established in 2007, just 2 years after the World Summit, at which the member states affirmed their responsibility for the protection of their populations from genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, and crimes against humanity, and agreed to assist other states to fulfill that responsibility and to take action collectively in accordance with the Charter when states manifestly fail to protect their populations. And the Secretary-General has, since his appointment, released a series of annual reports which clarify different aspects and dimensions of the responsibility to protect and its three pillars, the pillars of state responsibility and international assistance to protect populations. Broadly speaking, the work of both special advisors aims to advance national and international efforts to prevent genocide and other atrocity crimes. As I mentioned, the first element of our work relates to early warning, and this is where some of the issues raised in this book are particularly relevant. We term early warning as our methodology for assessing the risk of genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, and crimes against humanity in situations around the world and alerting the Secretary-General and the broader UN system where we see emerging concerns. And the information that we use to assess these risks comes primarily from the many UN sources, UN field presences, and the different UN offices, departments, and agencies. But we also obtain information from a wide variety of public sources from academia and from civil society organizations. If necessary, we also conduct information gathering missions to countries of concern when they let us. And if necessary, we do these fact-finding missions. Often we try to rely on sources of information that are already available, particularly through our UN colleagues. We've developed a particular methodology, which we call the framework of analysis, which sets out risk factors associated with the atrocity crimes that we monitor, and is based on the framework of international law, as well as on historical and current academic research, including research by some of the authors who contributed to this book, and the experience of practitioners on the ground, including our civil society partners. The Special Advisor on the Prevention of Genocide was mandated by the Security Council to act as a mechanism of early warning to the Secretary Council through the Secretary General, and to bring to the Council's attention potential situations that could result in genocide. The Council at that time assessed that it hadn't received adequate information in relation to the events in Rwanda in particular, and it expressed its determination to give, as it said, serious consideration to such information and analysis regarding situations which it deems to represent a threat to international peace and security. And as we have seen in the years since this statement by the Council, its response to situations where there is a risk, or in some cases its lack of response, has not generally been the result of the lack of information or the lack of relevant information. And it's often been more a case of other factors, including strategic interests and political will. However, we also know well that it's very important to provide relevant, timely, and accurate information about events on the ground to policy and decision makers, such as the Security Council and the other intergovernmental bodies. We've seen, partly as a result of this, I think, an increase in the number of commissions of inquiry and fact-finding missions in the last few years that have been established to look into allegations of serious, massive violations of human rights, including in Libya and Syria. And these provide very useful, credible information to the Council, as well as to the other intergovernmental bodies. We've also seen an increasing number of opportunities for the High Commissioner of Human Rights to brief the Council, which is also a really important development. Often, however, these kind of bodies and the briefings are provided when crimes are already ongoing in countries, and the Council continues to be somewhat reluctant to receive the kind of horizon scanning briefings that would put situations on its radar at an earlier stage. And despite his mandate, the Special Advisor on the Prevention of Genocide has only been asked to brief the Council on 2 occasions. Some members of the Council are even reluctant to have him in the room during briefings. And I believe we think this is probably because the word associated with the word genocide, and the Council gives them some obligation to act in situations where they may not be ready or be willing to take action. As I mentioned before, we've developed a particular assessment methodology to assess risk. And within the United Nations, but also outside, we're often asked about how this works and for example, what is the difference between assessing the risk of atrocities and preventing conflict, the risk associated with conflict? What is the value of this particular kind of assessment? And what is the difference? What do we do above what other parts of the system are doing in terms of prevention? And as Frances Stewart states in her chapter in this book, and as the Secretary General stated in this report this year to the General Assembly on the responsibility to protect, which looks at particularly at state responsibility and the causes and precursors of atrocity crimes, there is an overlap, and we know that there is an overlap in the risk factors associated with armed conflict and those related to atrocity crimes. Atrocity crimes are often and more likely to happen during armed conflict, especially civil war. And armed conflict is itself a source of risk of atrocity crimes. However, not all atrocities take place during periods of conflict, and not all conflict generates atrocities. What we find distinguishes atrocity crimes is the deliberate targeting of specific groups, or communities, or specific populations. There's also an overlap in terms of the risk factors associated with genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity themselves. History has shown that atrocity crimes are processes and not singular events. They don't happen overnight. And that there's no single cause or set of causes, but rather a multitude of factors associated with a heightened risk of these crimes. We also know that societies can exhibit multiple sources of risk and yet not experience atrocity crimes. And this can be due to sources of resilience within a society, or the absence of triggers or drivers. And as such, there are many and variable opportunities for states to build resilience to these crimes. The Secretary General's report sets out 6 main risk factors. And these include, for one, a history of discrimination or other human rights violations against members of a particular group of population, often on the basis of its ethnical, racial, or religious identity. And these factors apply to all these crimes: genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. Second, the underlying motivation of actors for targeting a community, whether for political, economic, military, religious, or other reasons. Third, the presence of armed groups or militia and their capacity to commit atrocity crimes. Fourth, the particular circumstances that facilitate perpetration of the crimes. Fifth, the risk of atrocity crimes can be increased by a government's lack of capacity or lack of will to prevent these crimes. And lastly, the commission of acts that could be elements of genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity itself increases the risk of these crimes taking place. A careful assessment of any situation where there is a risk of atrocities is important, not only to provide early warning, but because, as I mentioned, it helps to set out and break down the possible entry points for early action by different actors, whether it's the United Nations, by civil society, by the international community, to respond to the risk of these crimes and the kind of measures that could be taken to prevent them. The second element of our work relates to the development of policy options for the prevention or the response to these crimes in coordination with our UN colleagues and in coordination also with partners outside the UN system. We are also always emphasizing the importance of early engagement, the importance of prevention, focusing on prevention, because there are so many more options available if we engage at an early stage where we see risks emerging. And these options are so much less costly. And these options can include support, different kinds of support and assistance to states under stress, and to address different kinds of problems. Just to give one example, we have been supporting the work of the National Committee of Tanzania for the Prevention of Genocide, War Crimes and Crimes Against Humanity, which was established under the protocol of the International Conference on the Great Lakes region for the Prevention of Genocide. And Tanzania has been conducting what it calls interfaith peace forums to tackle an emerging problem of religious tensions between Christians and Muslims in Tanzania. And the initiative has been taken by Tanzania itself in cooperation with the civil society organizations, and we've been supporting them through funding the program and providing facilitation and experts to facilitate these programs. So this is just one initiative which shows what can be done at an early stage to address emerging concerns. In crisis situations within the UN, the different parts of the House come together to strategize about what is the best action, what kind of options are available to the UN, and what kind of things we should be recommending to the Secretary General. And I think that we're steadily improving the way in which we do this. Just before this meeting, I came from a meeting of focal points within the UN system who are beginning to follow up on an action plan to implement the findings, the recommendations that came out of the Secretary General's internal review process on UN action in Sri Lanka. And a lot of what we're doing through this process is directly relevant to what we're talking about today. How to better coordinate within the system, how to make sure that the right information is gathered, shared, and that it is acted on, that it reaches the right people, and that we are well informed to take action in a timely and a decisive way. But in the end, of course, much depends on states themselves and the action that they're willing to take, or the action that neighbours and other states are willing to support. But we still need to get this right within our own house. A third element of our work relates to engaging with the member states and with UN colleagues and civil society on the development of national, regional, and international initiatives for the prevention of atrocities, including through developing capacity building programs and technical assistance, and through the framework, all this through the framework of the responsibility to protect. And I'd have to say that the role of civil society in contributing to this kind of work is essential if it is to succeed. In the end, states have the first responsibility to protect their people, and many are already taking action to do so, including within the US. We had the great example of the Atrocity Prevention Board, and also there are many other initiatives that are taking place. One great example is in Latin America, where we've been working with the Auschwitz Institute to set up a network of states, and there are now 18 members, all of whom have started to take initiatives, particularly regarding training of security forces, police, but also national education initiatives to prevent genocide, to put in place measures to prevent genocide and other atrocity crimes. Of course, there are many challenges, and some of these have also already been set out. Primarily the challenge of political will. I thought it was very interesting, some of the proposals that were set out in this report about ways that we can try to increase political will and to influence states and increase consensus around the importance of these initiatives. I think a lot of the discussion that takes place about how to prevent atrocities is very much centered in New York and in other capitals, and it doesn't trickle down much to the field or to the people who are primarily affected by these discussions. Again, like civil society plays an important role in spreading the word, but we need to have much more information reaching many more people. And we need also to find ways to include the perspectives of communities themselves, the ones who are actually in need of protection and who are already taking initiatives to protect themselves. I think, we're still least effective when states themselves are the perpetrators of atrocities and are strong enough and with enough powerful friends to prevent international action, and as we are seeing in the case of Syria. We still need to consider what other tools are available to address these kind of situations. And finally, I think we should never lose sight of why we're doing this work. Many of us have worked in countries and situations where atrocities have been or are being committed. I have a photo in my office, on my office wall. It's a small black and white photo of a young child in a field, laughing in a field. And she was a young Jewish child who was hidden by farmers. Her family were killed, and she was hidden by farmers during the Holocaust. And I have this as a reminder to me about the responsibility of all of us to take action, and not to be bystanders in this process. So that's my commitment to never again. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gillian, and really thank you everyone on the panel for the presentations on this issue and this intersection, the important intersection of research and policy. So I want to open this up to questions directly from the floor. So I hope that as I look around the room that you have some questions, and we'll pass the microphone. Okay, so we'll go over here, and I'll try and take a few questions before I turn it over back to our panel. Thank you.
Lucy Webster from the Center for War Peace Studies. I wonder if you could indicate to what extent there is regional concern, not just national, state by state. You mentioned the situation, Ms. Kitley did, in Latin America, but in general, are there patterns whereby neighboring countries get together and try to address the problem or risk of genocide in their region?
Okay,
Hi there, Maria O'Reilly, IPI. Thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. It's a great book, which I've read and very much enjoyed. I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about the role of information and the role of advocacy. So I think it's a very interesting idea that we need to frame the issue so that states and different actors can see that it's in their interests to take action. And I wonder if you could speak a little bit more about who is most effective at framing the issues in this way. Advocacy groups, as we've seen with the Save Darfur movement, for example, on some levels can be very effective at raising awareness, and in other ways often encounter stumbling blocks. If you could mention a bit about that, both in terms of the book, but I'd also be interested to hear from a UN perspective on that. Thank you.
Is there another question? Yes, in the back for a third. Thank you.
Thank you. Gay Rosenblum Kumar with the UN Framework Team for Preventive Action. Thank you so much for this book and this panel. I really take to heart several of things that were said regarding how this needs to not only be in global capitals, but trickle down and have prevention and intervention together. What I wanted to ask about, and I think Gillian will be able to help me out, is the different challenges for different groups. And I'm thinking particularly of the Swiss initiative called GAMAC, the Global Action on Mass Atrocities Prevention. I don't know the whole acronym. But what they're doing is is there anyone here from the Swiss mission who will know more than I? I really admire what they're doing, creating a global network of member states, and they have over 50 so far, who are committing to action at national level through government focal points to do education, risk analysis, and action, as far as I know. And I'd just like to know how you see that fitting in. Thank you.
So I think what I'll do is maybe I'll go across the panel from my left to right. So Adam, if you want to take any of those, and then we'll go to Gillian and then Ernesto.
Sure. Just, I guess, one response on the question of regional activities. I think maybe Jill might be better placed to discuss current initiatives. The book has a whole chapter on regional organizations and how regional organizations factor into here. And something that I think we found is that in one respect, regional organizations are very well placed to be first responders. They're in the region. They also, as I mentioned, I think it's generally understood that partnering with a regional organization can help legitimacy of action. I think regional organizations also can provide important incentives for countries that are trying to establish reform measures. The European Union is the most famous example of this. I think the African Union has been has had mixed results. I think on paper, the African Union has made tremendous progress in terms of its move from the previous model of non-intervention to its current model of non-indifference to mass atrocity crimes. But as in all things with these issues, sometimes the application of the principles has been left wanting. In terms of civil society information advocacy, it's a great question. We actually discussed the book on Monday in London at LSE, and one of the panelists was the chapter author Yavor Rangelov, who wrote a chapter on transnational civil society for the book. And as you point out, I think one of what he describes as one of the things that civil society can do best is raise awareness, sort of provide a kind of a whistleblower sort of effect, and I think communicate information information effectively. Although over the long term, I think what the chapter describes is one of the biggest contributions of civil society is actually in norm development and actually putting issues actually on the table for action, which has been very important. You mentioned Save Darfur. That's actually a very important case in that chapter where there's a sense that Save Darfur was very effective at raising awareness about the genocide in Darfur, but that so much of the debate ended up being about whether it was a genocide or not, and not so much about how actually to solve the problem. And this can be difficult. So sometimes I think transnational civil society is very good at identifying problems and not always the best at articulating solutions. That's it.
Gillian, over to you.
Thank you. To your question, Lucy, about the regional organizations, we found that it's, in our work, given the sensitivities around our mandates, no state likes to be approached when you have genocide in your title, that it's often easier to approach states by approaching the regional organizations, approach them through the regional organizations. And that as a group, particularly if you can break down what it is you're trying to do, they're much more receptive to working with us, for example, on initiatives. And we found we've worked a lot through the regional organizations, particularly ECOWAS, which has a well-functioning early warning mechanism, which looks more at conflict prevention, but it's also considering now how it can perhaps adjust that slightly to be looking also at some of the risk factors that we associate with atrocity crimes. I said we work a lot with the International Conference on the Great Lakes region, which has 11 member states in that region who are each committed to establish national committees for the prevention of genocide and other crimes. I mean, this is a huge challenge in itself because of what is happening in that region. So I think it's probably a long time before many of those committees will be really effective, but there is a will there to actually start this work. So we find it's really has been really useful to work with them. We've been working also with the African Union, and again, as you were saying, there are challenges to working with the African Union, and it's made up of a lot of states who have a lot of challenging situations, and they have their own early warning mechanism, which doesn't function particularly well at the moment, I think. But there are definitely openings and opportunities there. We've also been working more recently with ASEAN. ASEAN doesn't have the same kind of structure. It's based on economic cooperation primarily, but it's gradually moving a little bit more to look at some issues related to human rights. And there's interest there. The Special Advisor briefed the Interparliamentary Association of ASEAN just a few weeks ago, and there is some interest there in beginning to work with us, particularly on how to address tensions related to identity and religion in the region. So I think it's really useful to work through these regional organizations as a way to reach states, but also because of the influence they have in terms of what their organizations are doing and the kind of the way the organizations are going in terms of strategy and priorities. Gay, is Gay still here? GAMAC is an amalgamation of two initiatives. One, which was led by Swiss, Argentina, Tanzania, and Cambodia, which was to set up national focal points for genocide prevention. And the other, which was led by Australia, Costa Rica, Denmark, and Ghana, which was an initiative to set up focal points for responsibility to protect. So they've now merged, and they're trying to work out what exactly, we're trying to work out terms of reference and a program for this group. It's complicated. This whole national focal point initiative is quite complicated because each state is different, has different structures, different ways of addressing these concerns, in different ministries and different setups. But they're trying to come up with like a common goal and a common kind of identity. And I think that the next meeting is going to be in March next year in Costa Rica. And taking lessons learned from those states which have already tried to conduct some kind of internal assessment to focus on the prevention of atrocities, what these initiatives look like, how they can take from them and provide advice to other states, if that answers your question. The role of advocacy, I think what you said is very relevant. I think civil society provides a is an extremely important role in advocacy in terms of being able to say things that we cannot necessarily say, from within the UN system, particularly based on information that is gathered from the ground. And I'm thinking, for example, the Sentinel project in Sudan, which provides incredibly strong information about what is happening there, but also the work of Human Rights Watch or ICG, which the kind of reports that they produce are just essential in terms of helping us to do our work, because they come out with really solid, credible information about what is happening, which supports the reports of other parts of the organization.
So Ernesto?
Well, I don't want to repeat what my colleagues up here have already said, so I'll just say a few brief things, particularly about the question on information and advocacy that you raised. There's a lot of work that, of course, is being done not only by very high-profile civil society or in advocacy organizations, kind of ICG, Amnesty, Human Rights Watch, and groups like this, but there's also a lot of really important monitoring work that's being done at a much more meso or even micro level in different regions around the world, in different countries. And some of these groups have started to connect with one another and create alliances and different umbrella groups in order to be able to communicate information more broadly for the purposes of genocide and mass atrocity prevention. So there's been some efforts on this in Kenya and Tanzania, for instance. And I think that's really important. It's important for several reasons. One, because one gets richer information in that way, that compared to what one gets at a very macro or kind of universal level. But in addition to that, it's a way of broadening the scope of stakeholders on genocide prevention, which is very, very important, of course, or mass atrocity prevention, I should say. And that's very, very important. And it's particularly important, I think, in the context of this work, of this volume, where we spend a lot of time thinking about response as kind of our primary framework, rather than just prevention or intervention. And response includes a concern over all sorts of material conditions that lead to mass atrocities. To think about those material conditions, economic injustice, inequality, poverty, et cetera, requires bringing in civil society and opening up the ability of civil society to participate effectively, politically, socially, and economically. So there are a lot of different ways in which civil society and advocacy groups can participate in these efforts that I think sometimes, from the perspective of New York or from capitals, we pay lip service to, but we don't really do much about it. We don't really have a good way of thinking beyond the very elite level of advocacy organizations and thinking more broadly and more substantively about civil society groups kind of on the ground. And that can include civil society groups that deal with questions of injustice, like material injustice, but also over questions of gender or minority rights, et cetera. So that's the first part of my comments. The second part, I'd simply add that in addition to really important work being done by advocacy groups on getting information out, there's also really important scholarly work that's being done, and it's become much more sophisticated over the past 5 to 7 years, I'd say, in terms of thinking about how violence spreads. And one of the really unfortunate things is that scholars tend to talk only to scholars, right? Partly the problem is that we don't write very well, so no one wants to read what we write, which is understandable. I prefer, that's why I'm here, actually, because I'd rather be with you than with those people. But that's only part of it. I mean, part of it also is that we produce work that is mainly meant for other scholars. So even though I think there's very good quality work done on the causes of violence and kind of the dissemination of violence and patterns of violence, et cetera, we don't do a very good job at explaining that in a way that's policy effective and policy relevant. But I will say that there is some important work being done, particularly, for instance, by scholars using geospatial information, geospatial modeling. So looking at not only the really macro level risk assessment factors and causes of violence, not only the stuff that, for instance, Barbara Harf and Ted Gurr looked at that has been so informative for this kind of community, but also looking at how violence spreads at a very micro level and being able to tag this stuff using satellites in order to understand how violence spreads both spatially and temporally. And it's really, really sophisticated work. The Uppsala Conflict Database Program out of Uppsala University in Sweden is really one of the cutting edge places for doing this kind of work. PRIO, the Peace Research Institute of Oslo, also does this. It's basically the Europeans who are kind of at the cutting edge of this, to be quite honest. And they're giving us really, really sophisticated ways of thinking about and processing huge amounts of information, but we as scholars need to do a better job at getting that out, not only to advocacy groups, but also to organizations like the UN and states. So, work to be done.
Thank you. And the information on the data there was fascinating. And Gillian, you wanted to add something.
Just quickly, in response to your question, I meant to mention also the work that we've been doing with the International Conference on the Great Lakes region to set up national committees. We strongly recommended it with each committee that the committee includes not only members of the government but also civil society. And each committee has been set up based on that. And we think it's extremely important because they add a level of accountability apart from anything else. And the states don't always accept this very happily, but we found that it actually makes the committees much more effective. It's very important.
I think our plan was to wrap up at 2:30. So now I'd like to add one question, and then I am going to wrap this up. And given, here at IPI, but certainly the UN has had a focus on women, peace, and security with Resolution 1325. I think it's 12 years old, roughly. And so what about on this issue? What's how can you bring the gender lens on this issue? And so I just open that up to the panel for any comments as to who would like to. I hope at least one of you will. Okay, Ernesto, no, and maybe Ernesto and finish.
Okay, I'd say a few things. That's an extremely important question. We know, for instance, that certain forms of mass atrocities tend to be highly gendered, particularly genocide, for instance. Not in all cases, but men tend to be targeted for immediate killing. Women tend to be targeted in a different way for all sorts of different types of violations and then killing. And these patterns are not only appalling, but they're patterned. That means that we can identify some of the risk factors that can help us basically forecast or see what's happening, how this stuff is developing. So I think the gender perspective is important for thinking not only about the causes of violence, but also being a bit more sensitive to what tends to happen in these debates where we draw very strong distinctions or very strong lines between political violence and non-political violence. And we see that when we bring a gendered lens to studying violence, we see that the political, non-political distinction becomes very permeable. So for instance, in cases of civil war, we see that there tends to be high levels of violence in the private domain against women prior to the breakout of political violence. We also see that once political violence or civil war has ended, gendered violence, particularly violence against women, continues again in the private domain. And sometimes there's a tendency to give very clear start and stop points to civil wars or to instances of political violence. And by doing that, we truncate what essentially we should be looking at. And that means that we're not looking at much more systemic, much more cultural and material conditions that produce violence. So I think the gendered lens is a really important way to get to give us a new perspective that breaks down some of these public, private, political, non-political distinctions of violence.
Thank you. And Gillian?
Ernesto's just said many of the things that I would have said. But just, I think that it's really important that the way that women are affected, both before, during, and after conflict and atrocities is different. And we need to take note of that. And another thing that we need to pay much more attention to is the fact that women often are aware of changes in their communities at the local level in a different way from men, and we could use this information much better to provide us with early warning of crises and the risk of atrocities. This has been documented in many different situations, but I think we're still not quite there yet in terms of paying attention to this kind of information.
So okay. So now, Adam, you can chime.
Yeah, I would just add one thing, because I think. Both these elements about the way that gender might help in terms of early warning and understanding the violence. I think also something that Jill had said earlier made me think that, I think the gender perspective would also be very helpful in understanding the way forward, or how to work on prevention. And that is as Jill said, we see many societies with the same risk factors, but that perhaps have different results in terms of their experience of violence because of the resilience of their societies or their absence of their triggers. And I think that understanding the gender dimension in the resilience of societies. Their resilience to the risk of mass atrocities and stuff would be a very important element to this.
No, so really, I thank all of you today. I certainly congratulate Adam and Ernesto, and certainly admire the work that you're doing, Gillian. And thank everyone for joining us today at this discussion.